You're watching Plant Identification Through Personal Investigation with Angeline Whitmire. This plant portrait is for butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. One year, I discovered some butterfly weed on the property where I lived. I was thrilled with the bright orange color and with a fascinating inflorescence. That fall, the plant was covered with seed pods, which released their seeds. My expectation was that lots more butterfly weeds would soon be growing nearby. In fact, the very next year, I found another plant in a different spot. It bloomed beautifully. And the original plant I'd found the previous year was back, as I had expected. However, there were no seed pods on the plants that year. I waited and watched the third year for the flowers and for the seed pods. But again, nothing. No seed pods. For whatever reason, the flowers were not getting fertilized. It was confusing because when I looked at the place where the flowers had bloomed, I saw a knobby arrangement that I thought might evolve into a seed pod, but it didn't. Butterfly weed grows throughout North America. I found it in different places in this area and noticed how there might be a single plant, or there might be a large group of plants. Obviously, the larger group of these perennial plants were an indication of just how many years they had been flourishing and expanding in that spot. A plant can have multiple stems from a single taproot. The plants which bloomed well were always in sunny and dry places. For the fourth year that I observed the butterfly weed where I lived, I studied its stem and realized it was quite hairy. I studied the leaves. I knew they were linear in shape, and I had already noticed the prominent central vein. The leaf tips were pointed. Although I kept wanting to see the leaves as long and flat, they weren't. The edges were frequently wavy. In addition, the leaf edges were rolled under a little bit. The leaves were arranged alternately along the stem. By looking down from above, I could see what looked like a nice spiral arrangement of the leaves. That same year, the fourth year now, I began noticing the inflorescence before it bloomed. See how the youngest inflorescence is hairy and the somewhat older inflorescence has flower buds which are becoming smooth. A single plant can have several inflorescences, each about 2 to 4 inches across. I love the shape of the flower buds within the inflorescence. The inflorescence grows at the end of a branching stem, as seen from above, and as seen from the side of a blooming butterfly weed. That year, the plant had at least one seed pod. It also had a lot of knobby ends where no seed pods grew. This seed pod has fine hairs. I did not see the seed pod burst open that year to distribute the seeds. Determined to catch every phase of the butterfly weed, during the 5th year I made regular visits to the place where I had been watching it grow for the previous 4 years, and I caught the plants just as they began coming up in mid-spring. I was pretty confident this was butterfly weed, given the hairy stems. And the leaves were the correct shape, linear, with a central vein, and curled under margins. A month later, the hairy stem had grown much taller. The tops of the stems were changing, and the growth of an inflorescence became visible. A week later, and the inflorescence is clearer, with fuzzy flower buds. A week after that, the flower buds are growing into their distinctive smooth shapes. The strong stem of butterfly weed grows up about 2 feet and then splits into several branches. The inflorescence develops at the tips of these branches. Each distinctive inflorescence grows on a peduncle. The immature inflorescence on the left still has its flower buds crowded together. The inflorescence on the right is spreading apart, and it becomes clearer that this will be an umbel of flowers. Let's back up a little to see that umbel of flowers in different locations on the plant. In another week, some of the umbels have begun to bloom. See how the flower bud opens, the 5 petals drop outwards and downwards to become the 5 reflexed petals of the corolla. The upper part of the flower, the crown, has 5 scoop-like hoods, each with its own horn. Each flower is about 3/8 of an inch across. This photo shows several flowers in different stages of blossoming. Here's a close view of the crown with its hoods and horns. Check out Wayne's Word for some excellent illustrations of the intricate form and parts of the Asclepias flower. According to Wildflowers of the Smokies, the crown is created as a trap for flying insects. As an insect searches for nectar, its leg may slip into a small slit between anthers. If it is strong enough to extract its foot, it will also drag out a saddlebag-like structure containing pollen. Only the strong are capable of carrying so much pollen to another plant. And this explains why only about 1% of the flowers are successfully pollinated. It is now midsummer, and the flowers which bloomed first are now beginning to die. The petals shrivel. The crown shrivels. The colored parts of the flower drop off their individual pedicels. Gradually, the pedicel drops from the base of the umbel. When fertilization occurs, butterfly weed begins the process of making its seed pod and seeds. The tiny seed pod is covered with fine hairs. They look like feathers. A week later, the seed pods, 2 of them in this image, have grown large enough to be easily seen. Now it is obvious that the knobby part I saw in previous years is really the place where the flower pedicels had grown from the peduncle, and the remaining pieces of fringe are sepals. The pedicel to the new seed pod has thickened. A few days later, the seed pod looks like a miniature version of its final shape. Notice the sepals still clinging at the base of the seed pod. The seed pods are growing larger and look green now, with a covering of fine hairs. Well, looky here. This is a different butterfly weed growing in another spot about 20 feet away from the plant we've been studying so closely. And it is just starting to make its flower buds. Weeks later. About a month after the first plant seed pod began to develop, its color starts changing. It now has some hints of golden brown or of reddish brown. This close view shows the strong pedicel supporting the seed pod. Fine hairs cover nearly every part of the butterfly weed plant. The development of the seeds within the seed pod remains invisible. What we can see after another month of close watching is the exterior surface of the seed pod is drawing in or wrinkling. Some seed pods simply begin to turn yellow and brown without a lot of change to their surface shape. The ends of the plant stems, which do not have a seed pod, have already died. While the seeds are growing in their pods, the leaves move into their next phase. They turn yellow. The leaves gradually turn color from the top of the plant down toward the base of the stem. After turning yellow, the leaves turn crispy brown and drop off the stem. Even the stem turns from green to yellow and then to brown. We're now in the fall season. Some of the seeds have ripened, and the first seed pod surface disintegrates, releasing the seeds. 2 weeks later, all that remains of that first seed pod are some tattered bits of dried plant tissue. Another seed pod splits open and releases seeds. Some of the seeds are caught on stem hairs. Some seeds drop to the ground right below the plant. As the weeks go by, more seed pods mature and split along a seam, showing the neatly arranged seeds within the pod. Let's take a closer look at the seeds as they spill out of their pods. Each seed is attached to long and fine threads, which may emerge with wrinkles, and which expand upon release to become the seed's parachute for traveling some distance from the parent butterfly weed. A close view of the seed shows its shape. Let's go check on the second location. Oh yes, at least 2 flowers were successfully fertilized and new seed pods are growing. Here they are a few weeks later. And in another 2 to 3 weeks, they are splitting open. We can just see the seeds lined up inside the pod. On the same day, the first location of butterfly weed looks like this. The empty, dried seed pods have their own elegant beauty. Although I have focused on a larger plant in the first location I found it, there are now a number of smaller butterfly weeds within a foot of that plant. These 2 went through the cycle of shooting up in spring, and although they are not yet old enough to flower, they gain strength with their green leaves, which turn yellow in the fall before dropping from the plant. Next year, or a year soon after, even these young plants will bloom and attract their pollinators. This is Angeline. Thank you for watching and learning about Asclepias tuberosa, also known as butterfly weed. Visit identifythatplant.com for more images of butterfly weed, for plant identification resources, and for information about how you can confidently master the skill of correct plant identification.